Hi, everyone. My name is Curtis Mitch, and I'm from the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. And welcome back to the St. Paul Center's daily reflections on the Mass readings. Today, we're looking at the readings for Monday, July 13th. Now, normally in these segments, I like to focus on the gospel reading in particular, but today I'm going to do something a little different. The reading that really caught my attention was the first reading today, which comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 1, verses 10 to 17. In today's reading, we learn that liturgy and life form a unity, that serving God and serving our neighbor is something that goes together. They're bound together, and they're not supposed to be separated in any way, because the whole life of the covenant people is about serving God and serving one another. And that's when the problems arise, though, according to the prophet. When we separate these two things, when we drive a wedge between our worship of God and our service of others. All right, and our efforts to seek peace and justice in the society in which we live. All right, and so we can fulfill our duties to God, and yet sometimes, and this is where the prophets step in and remind us, sometimes we can then neglect our duties to our wife, to our children, to our colleagues, and to others that we know. All right. And the thing that the prophet wants to point out to us here today is that separation, that disconnect between our pious worship and the way we treat others and the way that we form our personal relationships with others and the way that we serve them is something that if we separate those two things, it is unacceptable to God and can even be offensive to God. Now, those are hard words to hear, as is often the case in the prophets, but they're words that are salutary, words that are necessary. We need to hear them even when they make us uncomfortable, because they challenge us to change our lives and to align ourselves with the straight path of the Christian gospel. So let's look at today's reading. I'm going to read through it, try to put it in context, and then try to draw out some of the most important lessons for us. So we begin, this is Isaiah chapter 1, beginning in verse 10. The prophet says, "Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the teaching of our God, you people of Gomorrah. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of he-goats. When you come to appear before me, who requires of you this trampling of my courts? Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hates. They have become a burden to me, and I'm weary of bearing them. When you spread forth your hands, I hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil from your doings before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, defend the fatherless, and plead for the widow." So what's going on here? Let's try to put this in historical context. Who is the prophet? The prophet is Isaiah of Jerusalem, right? The great prophet whose book appears at the head of the prophets in the Old Testament, 66 chapters long. Isaiah of Jerusalem is sort of like the Shakespeare of ancient Israel. All right, he has the most beautiful language and exquisite imagery that he uses to communicate God's message to his people. But he's also a very powerful preacher, one whose message packs a punch. He does not hold back from pointing out the real problems in his world and in his society and bringing God's revelation and God's message to bear in that circumstance. Now, the circumstance in today's reading, it takes place probably around 701 BC, right at the very end of the 8th century, in the midst of what is an Assyrian crisis for the people of Judah and Jerusalem. Okay, the Assyrians had already conquered northern Israel earlier on, a few decades earlier, and finally culminating in the destruction of Samaria and the complete dismantling of the northern kingdom of Israel by 722 BC. Now here, 2 decades later, the Assyrians are now sweeping down into Judah and threatening the city of Jerusalem. In fact, Jerusalem is completely surrounded and besieged at this point. Okay, the Assyrian annals of Sennacherib tell how the Assyrians had conquered 46 fortified cities of Judah. All right, so Jerusalem is completely surrounded. The countryside is laid waste. Everything has been sacked and destroyed except for one thing, and that's the city of Jerusalem. And that's where Isaiah finds himself. That's where Isaiah's preaching is ringing out in the streets. Okay, and why? And he's answering the question, why has all this devastation come upon us? Why did God allow the Syrians to pour into our land and to destroy our crops and our cities? Why are we besieged by a foreign power, especially this power that worships idols and pagan gods? Why has our God allowed this to happen? And Isaiah steps forward and says, it is because Israel has been unfaithful. It is because of their mass defection from the covenant that the Lord has allowed this chastisement, this discipline to overwhelm the land. All right. So much so that Israel has become, he actually says in right before today's reading in verse 10 and verse 9, he says, if the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, that's the citizens of Jerusalem, we would have become like Sodom and like Gomorrah. They would have been completely wiped out. But God in his mercy leaves that little remnant, okay? He holds back the full force of his judgment so that there's room for mercy there at the end. And that's where Jerusalem comes in. So that's the problem in general. What's the problem specifically? Well, you will sometimes read biblical scholars who say that the problem here is with liturgy itself, that God is critiquing this sort of the physical, bodily worship of God in ritual and sacrifice. Well, to be honest with you, that's wide of the mark. That's not what the prophet is saying. We know that that's not what the prophet is saying because God commanded Israel to offer sacrifices, to offer incense, to offer prayers in the temple. All right, read the book of Leviticus, the whole liturgical apparatus, all the great feasts and services to God are mandated in the law of God. So God is not critiquing his own laws for the people to worship. There's something else going on. And there's generally identified 2 problems here that Isaiah kind of puts his finger on, and where Isaiah goes to the people and says that your worship is faulty and problematic for 2 reasons. One is called formalism. The other one is just straight up rank hypocrisy, okay? Formalism. What's formalism? Formalism is when you're going through the motions of worship. You're going through the actions of religion, all these pious activities that fill our lives, but our heart is not in it. Okay, later on in the book of Isaiah, we learn that Isaiah confronts the people of Jerusalem once again, and God speaking through him says that this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Okay, when you're just going through the motions, but your heart is not in it, you're falling into this pitfall, into the trap of formalism. Okay, it becomes exterior without that interior component, when in point of fact, the liturgy is meant to give bodily and physical expression to the movements of the soul. Okay, they're not just mindless activities. These are things that are meant to express our soul's deepest longing. This is how our souls reach out to God in an incarnational way. All right, it's through our bodies. And so we see the people of Israel here, they're observing their Sabbaths, they're observing the Feast of New Moons, they're observing these solemn assemblies. They're offering incense, they're offering prayers, and they're offering sacrifices, just as the Lord commanded. But their heart's not there. They're not truly worshiping him. They're simply going through the pious actions that they've learned. So that's the problem of formalism. But it runs a little deeper here, according to the prophet. There's also the problem of hypocrisy, of observing the exteriors of religion without the ethics of religion. So the people of Israel here, in Jerusalem here around 701 BC, as we said, are serving God in the temple, and then they promptly forget about God as soon as they walk out of the sacred precincts. When they return to their lives and go back to their individual occupations with their families and their friends and their colleagues, all of a sudden God's law doesn't matter anymore. All right, that's the real problem here, is that there's a disconnect between their confession in God and their conduct once they leave the house of God. All right, there's a great passage in the New Testament that I think helps us to remember and kind of wrap our minds around this idea. And it's from the book of James. The book of James, chapter 1, verse 27 says that religion that is pure and undefiled before God and the Father is to visit widows and orphans in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So true service of God necessarily involves a service of others, especially those who are most in need of our help. So that's really the solution according to the prophet Isaiah. What do we do about this? We cease to do evil. We learn to do good. We seek justice in the public square. We correct oppression of the poor and the powerless. We defend the fatherless, and we plead for the widow. All right? We bring our confession and our conduct into alignment, because you can't obey part of the covenant and be faithful to the covenant. The only way to be faithful to the covenant is to obey the entire thing, is to embrace all of the demands of the yoke of God's covenant that he puts upon his people to guide them and lead them. And so when it comes to our worship, we don't offer animals and sacrifice. We don't observe the Sabbath and the Feast of New Moons and things like that. Our worship is a little different than that, but there are lots of similarities. And so I think there's a lesson that we can take with us as well. And that is, we as Catholics have to put our heart and our soul into our worship of Jesus Christ. When we attend the Divine Liturgy, it's not sufficient, nor is it acceptable to the Lord to simply go through the motions. Our heart has to be present. Our souls have to be reaching out to Christ. All right? It is a place where we encounter Jesus Christ anew in his scriptures and in his sacrament, in the sacrament of the Eucharist. All right? In fact, as Catholics, there's even a closer relationship between our worship and our work, because our worship in word and sacrament actually empowers our ability to be witnesses to Jesus Christ in the world. All right? And that's what the Mass is about. We go forth. The Mass has ended to glorify God with our lives, all right? So we bring our confession into daily life and into all of those relationships that we have with other people. I hope this has been helpful to you. I pray that God blesses you and your family and your day, and we'll see you here again next time.